Welcome to part 2 of this free multi-part course, An Introduction to Zbrush 2020. If you haven't already seen part 1, make sure you do, as each part builds on top of the previous part. I'll make sure I leave a link to part 1 in the description. If you've already seen part 1 and have run into issues, watch the video where I troubleshoot some of the problems most beginners tend to run into. If that doesn't address your problems, then leave a comment below and I'll go over it in the next part. So before we begin, let me give you an overview of what I will cover in this part. So we're going to start by taking a closer look at the UI. After that, we'll go over object manipulation. Then we'll take a look at the different ways we can add resolution to our sculpts. We'll then take an in-depth look at brushes. Finally, we'll discuss subtools before moving on to the video demonstration, where I'll apply everything we've discussed in this part. After which, I will give you some homework assignments. So the last time I gave you a brief overview of the UI, today we're going to take a much more in-depth look. So we already spoke about the lightbox. The lightbox basically gives you access to your different projects, tools, some additional brushes, alphas, and also your quick save files. So we'll move on to edit, and what edit does is it basically lets you toggle between a 2.5D canvas and the 3D viewport. So if I were to turn this off, it's going to ask us if we want to switch to 2.5D mode, and if I say switch, this is the result we're going to get, where it basically starts to draw out your selected primitive here. And to get back to our 3D viewport, all we have to do is toggle this, and the hotkey for this is T. So, and to clear this up, all you have to do is hit Ctrl N on the keyboard, and that's going to clear your screen up, and it's just going to leave your active primitive. Next we have draw, and draw is going to be active by default whenever you're in the 3D viewport. Next we're going to take a look at the 3D gizmo, and the 3D gizmo can be activated by just hitting either W, E, and R on the keyboard, or simply coming up here and clicking on Move, Scale, and Rotate. So if we activate this, it's going to bring up our 3D gizmo here, and if I move this, it's going to give us this result. And the reason for this is because we have symmetry on. So all we have to do is switch symmetry off if we want to move our primitive around in the viewport. So I'm just going to hit X on the keyboard to toggle symmetry off. And now if I move this around, it's going to move things in its respective axes. The next thing we have here is this ring, and this ring is basically going to let us rotate our primitive like so. And the square that we see right here in the middle is going to let us scale up and scale down our model. So after that, if we move off to the side here, you can see that we have this Sculptress Pro mode. And actually before that, let me just address this thing right here. So this icon here is 3D gizmo, and if I turn this off, it's going to give us access to something like this. And this is the legacy move tool, and I'll talk about this a little later on. For now, I just wanted to show you what that did. So I'm going to talk about the next thing, which is Sculptress Pro mode, which is going to let you draw on your mesh while adding subdivisions to that area. And the next thing we have here are some options that can be easily activated by pressing spacebar. So we're just going to skip over all of this because we already discussed it, and I haven't spoken about these options here, and I'll get to these when we come to poly painting. The next thing is remember draw size per brush. So what this does is it's going to remember the size of your brush. When you switch over to a different brush and you make any changes to the size of the brush, it's just going to remember that. So we'll take a much more in-depth look at this later on. So the other thing we have here is focal shift and draw size, which we went over already, and I'm just going to skip over all of this and move on to active points. So what active points tell us is the poly count for this particular subtool that we are on right now, and total points tells us the total poly count of all our subtools combined. Right now we just have one subtool, so it's the active points and the total points are going to be the same. Now we're going to move off to the side here. So right on top here, we can see this BPR, which stands for Best Preview Render. So if I hit this button, it's going to render this model out. Under that, we have subpixel anti-aliasing render quality. And depending on which side you shift your slider, it's going to increase or decrease the render quality. Under that, we have this scroll document option, and this is not to be confused with scrolling in the 3D viewport. This is actually going to scroll your entire canvas like so. Under that, we have the zoom option, which again is not to be confused with zooming in and out in your 3D viewport, but it's just going to zoom your entire canvas in and out like so. So if you want to reset this, all you have to do is hit actual size, and hitting actual size will frame your canvas. And under that, we have this anti-aliased half size, which is again going to take your canvas and it's just going to decrease it by half the size. So under this, we have perspective, and hitting this button here is just going to toggle perspective on and off. And when sculpting, you'll want to sculpt with both perspective on and off. And under that, we have this floor grid. And when we hit that button, it's just going to toggle the grid on and off again. So I'm just going to turn that on, and I'm not sure you can see this, but there's an X, Y, and Z axis mentioned here. So if you just enable those, you can see that we have grids on the X, Y, and Z axis now. So I'm just going to toggle that off now. Now, if you want to know the hotkeys for these elements in the UI, all you have to do is hover over it. And if I hover over the floor grid, it's just going to say Shift P next to it, which is the hotkey. Under that, we have local symmetry, and we have a bunch of options here, which I will discuss at a later date. So the next thing we have is frame, and we already spoke about framing your model. Under that, we have move, zoom, and rotate, which again I covered in the last video. Now, I never introduced you to the options here because I wanted you to get used to using the hotkeys. Now, under this, we have polyframe, which we never went over in the last video. And what polyframe does is it activates your wireframe, and the hotkey for this is Shift F. And when I do that, it's now going to show us the wireframe for this model. Now I'm just going to toggle that off. Under that, we have transparent, and right now we're not going to be able to see the effects of that because we only have one subtool. So I'm quickly going to create another subtool here. So let's just move this so that you can actually see what's going on here. So let's say you have another subtool like so. Hitting the transparent button is basically going to make the inactive subtools transparent like so. And then we have another button here which says solo, and if I hit solo mode, it's going to isolate our active subtool. So if I hit that, solo is going to isolate this. And under that, we have expose, which is going to give us this sort of exploded view of our subtools. So if I just hit expose here, that's the result. And if I hit that again, it's going to take us to where we were. Now let's move on to this side. So right here we have our brush palette, which is going to give us access to all our brushes. And under that, we have the stroke menu, which is going to allow us to change the stroke type of our brush. And under that, we have alpha, which is going to manipulate the way the tip of our brush works. So if you want a softer edge or a harder edge, and so on. Under that, we have texture, which I don't really use. Then we have the matte cap materials here and the standard materials, and this is going to let you change the material of your model. Now, this is a good time to segue into the lights for a second. So I'm not going to go into detail with the lights here. I just want to show you how to change the lighting of your model while sculpting. So right now, if I try to make changes to the light here, nothing's going to happen. And the reason for that is because we are on a matte cap material. So we need to switch to a standard material. So I'm just going to switch to the basic material here. And now if we make changes to our light, you can see that it's taking effect. So it is good practice to change the lighting while sculpting so that you see your model under different circumstances. And so it's going to give you a better idea of how your sculpts actually look. And it can be quite deceiving if you just sculpt with one lighting setup. So I'm just going to get back to these palettes here. Under that we have the color palette. And then we have this gradient color option here and the main and secondary color, as well as switch color, which is just going to switch between the secondary and the main color. And under that we have alternate color, which is just going to paint the alternate color when we hold down Alt on our keyboard. So that covers most of the things in the UI, and I'll see you in the next section. Alright, let's take a look at object manipulation. So I'm going to hit W on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up our 3D gizmo. Now, in the last section, we looked at how we can move, scale, and rotate our object. Now we're going to look at some of these icons here and see what they do. So the first icon here says transpose all selected subtools. Right now we have just one visible subtool, so I'm going to head over to the subtool menu and I'm going to enable this second subtool that we have here. I'm just going to hold Alt and switch to the second subtool. And now, as you can see, when I make any changes, it's going to only apply to this one subtool. So if I scale this, if I move this up, if I rotated it, it's just going to apply to that one subtool. Scaled it down, whatever I did, it just applies to that one subtool. If I were to come and click on this icon again, you can now see that that icon changed. What this does is it's going to make universal changes to all the subtools that we have here. So if I were to move it up, scale it down, whatever I were to do, it's going to apply all this universally. So now I'm just going to check that again. I'm going to hide the subtool, move over to this, and we'll move on to the second icon that we have here. So the second icon is this lock. So if I were to unlock this, it's going to basically move our gizmo around. So we can basically use this to change the pivot of our gizmo. And now if I were to lock this again and start to make some changes, it's going to use this as the pivot point. So if I were to scale, this is the result, and if I were to rotate, it's going to use this as the pivot. And right next to this, we have reset mesh orientation. And if I were to click on this icon, it's going to reset our transformation. Right next to that, we have this little home icon, which is going to set mesh to axis. So right now, if I click on this, we're going to get an offsetted result. And the reason for this is because our gizmo here is not centered on the mesh. So if we want to center the gizmo on the mesh, all we have to do is come over here to go to unmask center and click on this icon right here. So now that we've got this 3D gizmo here, I'm just going to hit this home icon, and that's going to bring this object to the central axis. Right next to that, we have sticky mode, and if we just activate sticky mode, what this is going to do is it's going to keep your gizmo pinned to the same position. So if I were to move this up, it's going to pin this to the previous location. And I'm just going to uncheck that and move that back to the mesh center. Next to that, we have this little gear icon. And if we click on this, we can see that we get access to a bunch of deformers. Now, I'm not going to go over this in this video. We'll take a look at this in another video. So now we're going to come over here and disable the 3D gizmo, and that's going to give us access to this staff. And this is the legacy move tool. So if you want to draw the staff onto your object, all you have to do is click and drag. Holding down Shift is going to snap it at different increments. And the circle in the center here is going to move your object, since we are on the move tool at the moment. Now we have some circles off here on the side as well, and they do two completely different things. So I'm just going to redraw this onto the mesh. And now if I just click and drag, it's going to clip our mesh. And this can be very handy when doing hard surface design. The other thing here is just going to skew our mesh. Now, if you want to reposition this, all you have to do is click on the line here, and you can basically reposition this however you like. And then you can see that we have some more icons here. And if I just click on this, it's going to snap to the Y-axis. If I click on that, snap it to the X, and so on. We also have Z-axis, so if I click on that, it's going to snap it on the Z-axis. Now this transpose line can also be used to measure distance, and we can basically come up here and see that it says 4.2 units. And this can also be used to make sure things line up and so on. So the next thing I'm going to move on to is the scale. So I'm just going to draw this out again. And this time, if we come over to the ring on the extreme end here, this is basically going to scale our object in the X, Y, and Z axes. If I come to this, it's basically going to do something similar. And the one in the middle is again going to skew things in one direction. The next we have is the rotate tool. So I'm just going to draw this out again. And so let's just zoom out a bit so that we can see this a little better. So just going to draw that out again. Now, if I use this ring right here, what this is going to do is it's going to basically make this rotate around this axis right here. But if I were to use this ring here, it's going to make this rotate with this as the pivot point. So let's just try that again. So using this ring as the pivot point, it's basically going to rotate like so. And the one in the middle, I don't really use that one. And that pretty much covers everything when it comes to object manipulation. So I'll see you in the next section. Let's now take a look at how we can add more resolution to our sculpts. So in the last video I was working on the sculpt, and by the end I pretty much ran out of resolution to add more detail to this model. And so now I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which you could add more resolution to your model and therefore sculpt higher frequency detail onto your models. So I'm going to come over here to the geometry tab here, and I'm going to expand this. And so the first way we can add resolution to our model is by subdividing our mesh. So if you've already dabbled in 3D modeling packages in the past, you probably already know what I'm talking about. So for those of you who don't know what subdividing your mesh does, let me just demonstrate. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to hit Shift F on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up our polyframe. You could also just hit this button right here. The next thing I'm going to do is divide our mesh. So you could just hit divide here or Control D on the keyboard. So I'm just going to hit divide. And now you can see that our mesh got a little bit smoother. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the lower subdivision level so that you can actually see the added geometry to this. So if I delete, you can now see that we have a lot more resolution on this mesh. And so what happened was Zbrush basically took each face and it broke that up into 4 more faces. And as a result, we got a lot more resolution. Now, this is one way of going about adding resolution. Another way you can go about adding more resolution to your mesh is by dynameshing your model. So I'm just going to quickly undo this subdivision level that we have here, take the slider behind and hit delete higher. And I'm going to expand the Dynamesh tab. So as you can see, we've already been sculpting with Dynamesh. So I'm just going to increase the resolution to about 256. And I'm just going to hold down Control and drag. So similar to how we basically cleared the mask, we're going to do the same thing here. And that's going to basically re-dynamesh our model. So I'm just going to hold down Control and drag. And now it's going to project a new grid onto this mesh and thereby replace the old mesh with a new one. And as you can see, we already have a lot of resolution here. So we can go ahead and start to sculpt some high frequency detail on this. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you dynamesh, you're going to lose some of that detail that you had sculpted initially. So if you want to preserve your details, all you have to do is, let me just step backwards and let me activate project. And so once you activate project, what it's going to do is it's going to preserve all the details that you've already sculpted. And now if I hold down Control and drag, basically project all those details I had. And so now if I remove this frame, you can see that it basically preserved some of that detail that we had initially sculpted. So this is something you want to keep in mind when dynameshing. So if you want to preserve details, just make sure project is on. If not, it's fine to just leave that off. And so if you want to add more detail, just slowly sort of increase the slider. You don't want to add too much because then you're just going to end up crashing ZBrush. So another thing to keep in mind when you're dynameshing is you want to make sure you either free subdivision levels or delete your subdivision levels. So let me just show you. So I'm just going to undo all this. And so I'm just going to take this up by one subdivision level. And I'm just going to switch Dynamesh off, and I'm going to activate Dynamesh again. And then it's going to give us this little warning saying that the mesh has multiple subdivision levels. And so in order to Dynamesh, you need to either freeze your subdivision levels or you need to delete your subdivision levels. So I'm just going to go ahead and say no, and it's going to delete our subdivision levels for us, and then it's going to activate Dynamesh. So that's something you want to keep in mind. So now I'll go over some of the options here and I'll explain a little bit more in depth as to what all this does. So let me just collapse the Dynamesh, and we're just going to focus on this and Dynamesh and nothing else. So if I were to subdivide this mesh, it's going to enable a few options here. So the first thing we see is a lower subdivision resolution. The second is this slider, and under that we see delete lower. So what the slider does is it basically enables us to dynamically move between different subdivision levels. And if I were to subdivide this again, now we have 3 subdivision levels, and we can easily move between all these 3 subdivision levels. And you can keep adding more subdivision levels as you see fit. So if you want to sculpt high frequency detail, you want to sort of use a higher subdivision level. And let's say you're in the middle of sculpting and perhaps you want to change some of the proportions. You can very easily do that by sliding this down and coming to a lower subdivision level and making those tweaks. It's a lot easier to make broad changes when your subdivision level is lower rather than when it's higher. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Now, since we move the slider off to the side here, we can see that some of the options got enabled here. So if I were to bring the slider in the middle, you can see we have all these options available here. So delete lower is basically going to delete the lower subdivision levels, and delete higher is going to delete the higher subdivision levels. And under that we have free subdivision levels, and what free subdivision levels does is it basically tries to preserve these subdivision levels. So once you freeze your subdivision levels, ZBrush is basically going to store that. And let's say you want to Dynamesh after that and you want to then bring back your subdivision levels, the next option is going to let you do that, and that one's called reconstruct subdivision levels. And this may or may not be successful all the time, so that's something you want to keep in mind. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, and then we have low res subdivision, and that's just going to move that to your lowest subdivision level. High res is just going to move it to the next highest resolution. And yeah, after that, let's talk a little bit about smooth here. So subdivide smooth modifier. So by default, this should be checked on. And what this does is it basically applies a subdivision modifier to your mesh. And with smooth active, it also decreases the volume of your mesh and it starts to smooth and relax things out. Now, you might not always want that. For instance, let's say you're bringing in a mesh from another program. Let's say you've modeled something and you don't want this smooth modifier to be applied on that. You simply just want to increase the resolution without smoothing. So in that case, you want to make sure that you turn this off and then hit divide, and then go ahead and sculpt whatever high frequency detail you want to. So let me just show you how this works. So let me just bring up a new mesh. So let's take this cube right here. And let's turn the polyframe on. Now, if I were to divide this, actually let's go to a lower subdivision level and let's delete the higher level. Now let me hit divide. So as you can see, when I divide, it's going to start to smoothen things out with this active. Now I'm going to bring that down and I'm going to say delete higher. Actually, let's just demonstrate that on a new cube. So yeah, so let me just delete the higher level. So now with this turned off, if I hit divide, you can see that our mesh is getting divided, but it's not being smoothed. So this is something you want to keep in mind if you want to bring in a mesh from another program and you simply want to divide it without smoothing it. So I'm going to hop back into Dynamesh and let me just show you something else that Dynamesh can do, which is basically welding meshes together. So I'm just going to bring up and insert mesh brush and just make sure that you delete your lowest subdivision level, otherwise you can't use insert mesh brushes. So if I draw on this, it's going to give me a warning saying you need to either freeze or delete your subdivision levels. I'm just going to go ahead and delete. So now I'm just going to, let me do that again. So I'm just going to drag out this sphere and I'm going to reposition this using the gizmo, and I'm going to switch polyframe off. So now you can see that when we use this insert mesh brush, the main mesh got masked. And so in order to apply Dynamesh, you need to make sure your masks are cleared. So if I hit Dynamesh now, nothing's going to happen. That's because we have a mask active, and I'm just going to basically clear that mask. And now let's switch back to polyframe. Let's take a closer look at this. So as you can see, these two meshes are separate. And if I were to come here and hit Dynamesh, you can quickly see that it basically welded these two meshes together. And so this is one of Zbrush's powerful features. And there are plenty of ways this can be applied. For instance, you can use this to quickly block out your base mesh before you begin sculpting and so on. So I've spoken about project, Dynamesh, and resolution, and for now that's all you need to know. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much of information because this is already getting quite long. So now I'm going to move on to the next feature, which is Sculptris Pro. So I'm just going to open up a new project and I'm going to keep this polyframe on, and I'm going to switch to a regular brush and I'm going to activate Sculptris Pro. So once I activate Sculptris Pro, this is another way of adding resolution to your mesh. However, you can add resolution in specific areas. So sometimes when you're sculpting, you probably don't want to add resolution to your entire mesh, and maybe you just want to focus your details in a very specific area and only increase your resolution in that specific area. With both the subdivision modifier as well as Dynamesh, you basically remesh the entire model, and that can really increase your poly count. So if you just want to add details in a very specific area, Sculptris Pro is what you need to be using. So I'm going to start just drawing on the mesh with Sculptris Pro active, and as you can see, it's basically adding a lot of resolution to that portion there, and this is dependent on your brush size. So if you have a larger brush and you sculpt, it's going to sort of add less detail, and the more tinier your brush is, it's going to add in more detail. So be very aware of this, because if you start sculpting with an extremely small brush, you can increase your poly count to a very high number and end up crashing ZBrush. So again, if you have a larger brush, it's going to basically add less resolution, and smaller basically is going to add more resolution, as you can see. So this is a great way to add details to very specific areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about Sculptris Pro in the future. For now, I just wanted to introduce you to this tool and show you how it works. So with that being said, let's move on to the next section. Now let's take an in-depth look at brushes. So the last time I introduced you to the clay buildup brush, the move brush, and the Damien standard brush, and for the most part these are the brushes that I use for sculpting. And there are some other brushes that I use a lot for sculpting as well, which I'm going to introduce you to today. So the first brush is the Trim Dynamic brush, and to access the Trim Dynamic brush all you have to do is hold down B, T, and D, and that's going to bring up this Trim Dynamic brush. So this brush is great if you want to establish planar surfaces, and this is also a great brush for hard surface sculpting. So you can very quickly see that we can establish planes with this brush. The other brush that I'd like to introduce you to is the snake hook brush, and the snake hook brush is a very powerful brush, and I tend to use this a lot when I'm sculpting at a higher resolution and I need to make broad changes to the mesh. So this is, you could think of this almost as a very powerful move brush. So when you're using the move brush at higher resolutions, it can be sort of difficult to get the result you want, and it's not very fluid. Whereas the snake hook brush is extremely fluid at higher resolutions, and you can just pull and push geometry very easily. And that combined with Sculptris Pro can basically give you some very interesting results as well when sculpting. So I'm just going to undo all of that. So now we want to introduce you to the mask pen. And just like how we access the smooth brush by holding down Shift, all we have to do is hold down Control, and that's going to bring up this mask pen. And now we can just draw on top of our mesh. So what the mask does is it basically protects this surface. So if I were to now sculpt something, it's now not letting me sculpt on that protected region. So it basically protects this region from any kind of influence from our brush. So I'm just going to undo that, and now I'm going to show you how to invert this selection. So to invert this, all you have to do is hold down Control and click, and that's going to invert your mask. And if, let's say, you want to subtract from this mask, all you have to do is hold down Control and Alt at the same time, and now you can start to paint away like so. Now there are some additional options which we can find under the masking option. So I'm just going to expand this, and I'm just going to talk about some of the features here, and we're going to disregard all this for the time being. So the first one is we've got view mask active, and if we uncheck that, it's just going to hide our mask. So our mask is still there, but it's just hiding it from view. Now the next thing is inverse mask, which we already spoke about. So by just Control clicking, it's going to invert our mask, and right under the view mask we have clear mask. So if I do that, it's just going to clear our mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and mask this region off again. Mask all is going to obviously mask everything here. And then we have this blur mask and sharpen mask option. So if I click on this, it's going to blur our mask. And if I click on this, it's going to sharpen our mask. Now, there's an easier way of doing this instead of coming here and opening this menu here. So let me just mask this off once again. And now if I hold down Control and click, it's going to basically blur this mask. So as I keep clicking, it's going to blur that mask out. Now to sharpen our mask, all we have to do is hold down Control Alt and then click on our mesh, and that's going to sharpen our mesh again. Now we can also grow and shrink our mask. So if I hit grow mask, it's going to expand this, and I'm just going to hit sharpen mask so that we can sharpen that. So we can see that that mask is now expanded, and we can also shrink that down and then hit sharpen again, and we can see the difference. So that's pretty much it when it comes to masking. So if we just hop on over here to the brush palette, we can see that we have a wide variety of brushes here, but there are a lot of common things amongst these brushes. So if we just hover over our brush palette here, right now we are on the clay buildup brush, and it says we have a base type and that base type is clay. And this base type is shared by many other brushes. So let's just look at the clay brush. So the clay brush also has a base type clay, and the clay tubes has the same one, and the clay tubes constant has the same one as well. Now if we come over to the mask brushes here, so we have a whole host of mask brushes here, and the base type is same across the board. So it's all mask when you look at the base type. Similarly, if we shift over to the smooth brush, we see that the base type is blur. And so I urge you to just explore the brushes in the brush palette and see the brush type and see how things work. Now the next thing I want to move on to, oh yeah, and before we move forward, I forgot to show you the hotkey to clear a mask. So let's say you want to clear this mask now. All you have to do is hold down Control and drag outside, and that's going to clear your mask. And while holding down Control and clicking outside, it's going to also mask everything. And if I come and click on the brush palette while holding down Control, it's going to give you access to all the masking brushes. Now I'm just going to go ahead and clear that. So apart from this, we also have selection type brushes. So if I come over here, we have this select rectangle brush. And what this does is, let me just demonstrate this. So if I were to select this portion, right now we're on symmetry, so it's going to select both. I'm going to turn symmetry off for the moment, and I'm just going to reset that. So now if I were to hold down Control Shift and draw this, it's just going to select this portion. Let me just turn a double on so that you can see this a little bit better. So now you can see that only that selected portion is visible and the rest of it is hidden. Now if we want to invert this, all we have to do is hold down Control Shift and click on the mesh, and it's going to invert that, and it's going to basically select everything else but that. Now if we want to make everything visible, all we have to do is hold down Control Shift and click outside, and now it's going to make everything visible. Now there's also a way of inverting our selection. So if I were to hold down Control and Shift and drag, now I've released Control Shift and I'm going to hold down Alt. So now we see that we have this little red box. So if I were to accept the selection, it's basically going to cut that out, and it's going to leave the rest of the mesh visible. And again, we can just bring that back by holding down Control Shift and clicking. And that's pretty much it on the selection brush. We have a whole bunch of other kind of brushes here as well, like the clip brushes, the select, and the trim brushes. So we won't go over that in this video. We'll take a look at that at a later date. A lot of those brushes can be very useful for hard surface sculpting. Another mesh I actually forgot to introduce you to is the Insert Mesh brush. And to access this brush, all you have to do is hit BIT on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up our IMM primitives. Now there are a whole host of other Insert Mesh brushes as well, and you're free to explore that on your own. I'm just going to talk about this one brush. So now in order to draw this out onto your mesh, first you need to select a mesh, and we have a whole host of meshes here. Now you can also bring this up on the keyboard by just holding down M on the keyboard, and that's going to bring in this selection of meshes that we had on top here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on Polysphere, and now to draw this onto our mesh, all we have to do is click and drag. So clicking and dragging is going to create this primitive on top of our mesh, and we can then use the move, scale, and rotate tool to sort of position that into place. So once you're happy with that, you can now drag outside holding down Control, and that's basically going to clear your mask. So this is how you go about using the Insert Mesh brush, and you can also split this mesh off. So if you haven't already started sculpting on this, you could just head on over to Subtool and hit Split by similar parts, and then say OK, and it's going to split that new mesh off into a separate subtool. So that's just what I wanted to add to this section. So that's all I'm going to cover in this video. We'll talk about alphas and stroke type in the coming video. So I'll see you in the next section. Let's talk about subtools. So I'm going to begin by creating a dynamic sphere, and that's going to give us access to this subtool menu right here. So I'm going to go ahead and expand that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what subtools are. So subtools at first appear to be some kind of layer management system, and they can be treated that way, but that's not their primary function. Subtools essentially help you work around your computer's polygon limit. And what I mean by that is you can separate your mesh off into separate subtools as you approach your computer's polygon limit. However, the law of diminishing returns apply here as well. And so as you keep creating more and more subtools, there is going to be an overhead to pay. So what I mean by all this is, let's say your computer has a polygon limit of 3 million polygons. Once you hit that limit, you can basically split your mesh off into another subtool and continue to sculpt till you hit that limit again with that new subtool. And you can do this a few times before you start to run into some performance issues. So that's basically what subtools allow you to do, again, with some overheads to pay as you create more and more subtools. So now I'm just going to go through some of the different options that you can find under subtools, and I'm going to sort of walk you through the different options available here. So the first thing we see is visible count, and what visible count is, it lets you see a certain number of slots at once in this palette here. So if I increase this, it increases the number of slots in this palette, and if I bring down the value, it does the opposite. Now under that you can see this polysphere subtool here, and that is our current subtool, and it is selected right now, and that's what we see here in the viewport. If we come off to the side here, we can see this eye icon, and that basically allows us to toggle visibility on and off. So the next thing is, let's look at how we can add more subtools here. So if I come over here to append subtool and I click on one of these subtools here, so let's just create a ring. So now it's not visible because the ring, I think, is scaled down, so I'm just going to scale that up. Just make sure that I'm on the ring here and then scale it up. So now we can see that ring. So this is how you add in a subtool. So insert pretty much does the same thing, and if you want to know the difference, just hover over this and hold down Control, and you're going to get a little pop-up menu there where it's going to explain what append does and what insert does. So both of them essentially bring in a subtool into your scene. So now we can see we have two subtools that are visible here. Now if I toggle the eye off, now that turns our subtool off there, and if I toggle this off, we can still see the ring here even though I've toggled it off. And the reason for that is because we've currently selected this mesh, and therefore we can still see it. The moment we jump to a different subtool, it vanishes, and we can toggle that back on again using the eye icon here. So pretty simple. The next thing I want to talk about is how we can name these subtools. So if you come down here to rename subtool, right now we have polysphere selected, so I'm just going to hit rename, and that's going to give us this option here to name our subtool. So I'm just going to name it sphere, and to accept you have to hit enter, and as you can see the name has now changed there. And I'm going to select the next one and repeat the same process just to demonstrate, and that's what it does. So that's how you rename subtools. So the next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is duplicate. So if we come all the way down here, you can see this duplicate button, and what this does is it just duplicates your object here into a separate subtool. So if I hit duplicate, you can now see, since we had this ring selected, it's duplicated that as a new subtool. And delete pretty much does what it says, which is to delete the currently active subtool. So since this duplicate ring is what we have selected as our active subtool, hitting delete, it's going to say that this is an undoable operation, and so it's just giving us a warning there, and we're going to say OK, and it goes ahead and deletes that subtool. The next thing I want to talk about is creating folders. So if you've used Photoshop in the past, Photoshop has this function called groups, where you can create groups and organize layers in different groups, and folders pretty much do the same thing. So I'm just going to come over here and say new folder, and it's again going to ask us to name it. So I'm just going to name it folder and leave it as so. And if you scroll up here, since this was our active subtool, it's gone ahead and put this subtool into this folder here. So now I'm just going to show you the different things you can do with folders. So you can drag subtools from one folder into another. And it also indicates the number of subtools we have in here. So right now it says 2 subtools within this folder, and we can add more groups. We can add more folders into this. So I'm just going to, with the ring selected, that's our active subtool right now, I'm just going to say folder 2. And now what it's gone and done is it's basically created a separate folder for this ring. And now we can switch things over. And since the folder above had only one subtool, since I brought it into the folder number 2, that folder automatically got deleted. Now, there are a few icons here, and I'm just going to explain what these do. So the gear icon here basically enables us to perform certain actions. And I'm not going to go ahead and explain any of that because it's pretty self-explanatory. You can explore this by yourself. And then it has the eye icon here again, which is to simply toggle the visibility on and off. And again, it's going to keep the subtool that we have selected here visible. So that's something you need to just keep in mind. So I'm just going to create a few more subtools here just to illustrate some of the features. So now if you come down here, you can see these arrows. So what this arrow does is it just cycles through your different subtools. So if we click on this, it basically cycles up and this cycles below. And this basically moves subtools up and down. So this basically I've now rearranged the subtools, and you can basically select any subtool there and just push that to the bottom and so on. And you can also just drag and drop. That's I find that a lot easier to do. So after that, let's talk a little bit about how you can go about splitting subtools. So let me just hide these two and just leave the sphere on. So I'm just going to bring in an insert mesh brush, and I'm just going to insert, say, a sphere. So once we do that, we can now split these off into different parts. So how we can do that is by heading down here to the split menu here. And what this allows us to do is to split these by parts, by similar parts, unmasked points, and masked points. So I'm just going to go ahead and say split to similar parts, and what that's going to do is it's going to take these two similar subtools and it's then going to club them together as a separate new subtool. So I'm just going to hit that, and it's going to give us a warning here because it's an undoable operation, and I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. So now it has clubbed those two together into one subtool. So I'm just going to hide that sphere that we had, and now I'm going to say split to parts. If I say split to parts and accept, it has now split these two into 2 separate subtools. So if you want to quickly access subtools, instead of coming over here to the subtool menu, a quick way of doing this is by holding down Alt and clicking on the subtool you want to work on. So now it's switched to this subtool, and I can, let's say, work on this. And if I want to quickly switch to the next subtool, what I can do is just click on that and work on that. And that's a way we can quickly access subtools rather than coming here to the subtool menu and manually sort of going through all the options here and selecting a subtool. Another way you can also bring up your subtools is by hitting the letter N on your keyboard, and that quickly brings up the subtools that we have here on the screen. So those are just a few hotkeys while working with subtools. So the next thing I want to talk about is splitting by masked and unmasked points. So I'm just going to create a mask by holding down Control and selecting a part of the mesh. And then I'm going to hit split by either unmasked or masked points. I'm just going to hit unmasked points. And what that has now gone and done is it has split one part into a separate subtool. So if we come over here to the subtool menu, we can now see that it's basically sliced this in half along the selection I made and created it as a separate subtool. So now if I switch that off, you can see that, you know, the faces behind are not visible. And if you want to see the faces, you need to turn double shading on. And so you can find that in the display properties. Just come and click on double sided. So when you do that, you can now see the faces at the back as well. Let's now look at merging subtools. So I'm just going to collapse the split menu and I'm going to expand merge. And right now, some of the options here are grayed out. And if I just move up here, you can start to see that some of them come back. And the reason that was grayed out there is because this was the last subtool, and since we were on that, there's nothing to merge down on. So anyway, if I go up one subtool, it's not going to appear there. And what merge down does is it basically takes the subtool above and just merges it onto the one below. So if I do that, it's going to give us a warning since it's an undoable operation again. And I'm just going to go ahead and say OK, and it's now basically merged that into one subtool. Then there is also the merge similar option, and you can go ahead and play with all these options. I'm just going to show you the merge visible. So I'm just going to go ahead and say merge visible. And if I do that, it's going to, right now in the subtool palette, we can't see it. But if we come up here, we can see that it's actually merged as a new tool. So it's merged everything that we could see there as a new tool. And so this can be a little bit confusing. So now I'm just going to hop back over to what we had before. So that's what merge visible does. Now the other option I'm going to talk about, and the final one that I'm going to talk about in this subtool section, is extract. So I've gone ahead and created a new dynamic sphere to demonstrate the extract function. So I'm going to begin by just painting on a mask, and I'm going to hit extract. So what this has gone and done is it's basically extruded the region based on the mask that we painted there. And if I move off to the side, you can see now that extraction that we did there disappears. And the reason for that is because we never hit accept. So if we hit accept, what's going to happen is it's going to create an extraction, and it's going to basically create that as a new subtool. Now I'm going to talk about some of the options that we have here. So I'll just talk about what is most used. So one of the most used ones are thickness. So that's pretty self-explanatory. If I bump up the thickness, it's going to create a really thick extraction. If I just bring the value down like so, it's going to create a very thin extraction. The other thing I want to talk about is double-sided. So what double-sided does is, let's just activate double-sided. So now if I extract with double-sided on, it's basically going to create an extraction on both sides of the mask. So on this end, it's going to project out this way as well as inside the mesh. So let me just demonstrate that. So I've just gone ahead and extracted, and now I'm going to hit accept, and that's going to create a new subtool. I'm going to clear the mask, and I'm going to hide the sphere. So as you can see, it basically created a subtool on both ends. I mean, it's created an extraction on both ends based on the mask that we painted. And let's try without this on. I'm going to hit extract here and say accept. And now if we toggle that on, we can see that it's basically created a, let's just bring that back there. Yep. So we can see that it's basically created a extraction that is flush to the surface. And with the other one, it's gone ahead and created a extraction on either side of the mask that we painted on there. So that's pretty much it on extraction. Alright, so before we move on to the next section, I just wanted to go over something that I missed out while covering subtools. So you can see that we have this option here called all low and all high. So if we hit this option all low, what it's going to do is it's going to basically take all our subtools that we have here and it's going to bring that down to its lowest subdivision. So if we go to geometry here, we can see that this subtool has 4 subdivision levels and this one has 4 subdivision levels as well. So I'm just going to hop back here and hit all low, and you can instantly see that it's brought it all down to the lowest subdivision. And the same thing can be said for all high, basically pushes everything up to the highest subdivision level. And so the only other thing I missed out was this copy and paste option. So you can pretty much just copy your subtool and then hit paste, and it's going to paste it as a new subtool. But you can get the same result by just hitting duplicate as well. So that's pretty much it on this subtool section. I'll see you in the next one. So we're going to pick up from where we left off the last time. So I'm going to begin by subdividing the mesh here and switching to the clay buildup brush and starting to build up some of those forms of the year. So as you can see, we still don't have as much resolution as we need to. And so later on, I'll be activating Sculptress Pro and adding in some of those finer details. So for now, I'm just going to use the clay buildup brush to build up the form, the Damien standard to carve in. And then I'll be using the move brush to just shift things around and sort of fine tune the look of everything. Now this video is sped up by 4 times the original, and last time the demonstration was sped up twice the speed. And the reason I'm not doing this real time is because it would take an awful long time to get through everything. And that's why everything is sped up. If anybody's interested in getting the real-time video, then just let me know in the comments below. So now I'm using the move tool to just check my proportions and make sure everything is where it needs to be. Continuing to build up some of those forms with the clay buildup brush. And now I'm switching over to the back view and I'm just starting to tweak things. And right now I'm still sculpting with a subdivided mesh, so I'm just going to bring it back down because that way things are easier to move around when you are at a lower subdivision level. So when you need to make any kind of broad changes to your mesh, just make sure you switch over to the lower subdivision level when you're making those changes. So last time I had some issues with the anatomy, so I'm just going in and fixing that. I wasn't too happy with how low that zygomatic bone was. So just fine-tuning all those different things and continuing to sort of work on the ear now. Now, one thing to keep in mind while sculpting on thin surfaces such as the ear is to make sure you have back face masking active. This way you can prevent your mesh from developing holes as you sculpt on them. Now I'm just going in and carving out the eye socket, and we'll be using an insert mesh brush here to basically insert a sphere for the eye. So it's going to ask us to either freeze our subdivisions or to delete our subdivisions, and here I go ahead and delete the subdivisions since I don't need that lower subdivision level. I think I'm in a good place now, so I've gone ahead and deleted that, and now I'm splitting off the eyes into a separate subtool, and I'm continuing to sculpt around that sphere now. Now the eye is a spherical structure by nature, and while you're sculpting forms around the eye, just make sure it conforms to that underlying structure. Now I've masked off the brow region and I'm making some tweaks to the eyelids. Continuing to just move things around with that move brush. And then I'm using the build-up brush to add more detail. So it's going to take a while before the eyes start to look all right. Again, these are like the focal point of the face, and so they require a lot of work. So now I'm using the 3D gizmo here to just make sure that I position those eyes properly. And now I switch back to the head subtool, and I'm continuing to work on those eyes, continuing to build up some forms near the bridge and just fine-tuning things. Now I'm masking off the eyes, and I'm using the move tool to rework some of my proportions here. And now I'm just smoothing things out. So over here you can see that I'm dynameshing this and projecting the details while I dynamesh. So the reason I do this is so that I don't end up fighting with the topology, and the dynamesh basically remeshes everything, and so it becomes easier to sculpt when I'm using brushes that do depend on topology. So now I'm using the Damien standard here to carve in, and the move brush to just move things around. Again, reviewing everything from different angles, just making sure everything reads well. So a lot more subtle changes as opposed to what we were doing in the first video. Continuing to work on that lower lid with the clay builder brush. And so it's a lot of back and forth and reviewing and then going over it again. Continuing to sort of add more detail to that eyelid. And now I'm using the trim dynamic. This is a great brush to sort of flatten things out. So continuing to shape those eyes. And things are starting to look a little better here. So now on the Damien standard, and I'm carving in building up some more form under those brows. And I'm a lot more happier with my proportions at this point. Continuing to fine-tune the forms. Just reworking a little bit of that jaw as well. Now I'm doing another pass over all these forms just to fine-tune everything. And I'm switching over to the move brush and making some more tweaks to the proportions to add some personality to this character. And you can also see that I'm toggling perspective on and off, and it's good to sort of check your model under different circumstances just to make sure everything reads well. So continuing to use the clay builder brush to make some very subtle changes. Now I'm switching over to the Damien standard and I'm refining those eyelids. Just making very small tweaks to everything. Adding a little bit more detail to those lids. Continuing to work a little bit more on the nose as well. Now I'm using the Damien standard to carve in to the lips as well. So now I'm reviewing my model and everything looks okay, so I'm going to break symmetry and I'm going to start sculpting, and this is where we can really bring out the personality of this character. So I'm just going to go over all the forms, sculpting asymmetrically. Using the same set of brushes, the clay builder brush, the Damien standard, to add some of those tertiary details. I'm using the Damien standard brush to carve in some of the wrinkles. And I'm switching back to symmetry here and just making some more tweaks to the proportions and reviewing my sculpt. Then I switch back to the Damien standard and start to carve some wrinkles on the forehead as well as some wrinkles near the brow region. And I use the clay build-up brush to build up some of those tertiary forms. Now, we won't be going into too much detail here as this is not a head sculpting tutorial. The purpose of this video demonstration is to illustrate Zbrush's toolset. Now, in the next part, I might come back to do a detail pass, but that's pretty much it. We're not going to push this particular sculpt too far because sculpting the head is actually quite a complex subject. Now I'm continuing to build up some of those tertiary forms, making small tweaks here and there. And now I'm using the move brush to sort of change that nose a bit. And I'm using the Damien standard to carve in some more wrinkles. Now this is starting to look a little bit better. So now I'm activating the lights and I'm switching over to the basic material so that we can see that light and how it's affecting the model. So I'm reviewing the model under different lighting circumstances here, and this is good practice just to make sure all your forms are functioning well. So now I'm switching back to the matcap gray and continuing to refine that eyelid. Just smoothing things out, building forms, and then smoothing them back. And I'm just making sure everything that I do here is very, very subtle, not making any radical changes here. So just reviewing my mesh again, and now I'm just activating Sculptress Pro here. And this is a great way to add detail to limited portions of your mesh. So I'm just going in, masking things out, and tweaking some of those details on the ear. Continuing to do the same process to the other side as well. So again, masking off regions and tweaking portions. Then going in, reviewing things again. So just continuing to just fine-tune everything here. Another thing to keep in mind is that when Sculptress Pro is active, you're essentially adding more geo to your model as you sculpt. So it's very important that you pay attention to your poly count. Otherwise, you can end up crashing Zbrush, or things might slow down drastically. So it's important that you use Sculptress Pro judiciously when it's active. So now I'm continuing to add some tertiary details to the eyelid and just refining everything. So the Sculptress Pro really helps in adding a lot of that minute detail that we need without having to subdivide our entire mesh. I'm using the move brush to make some asymmetrical changes to the model, and I'm using this smooth brush to go in and tone down some of those areas that have harsh brush strokes. Now I'm continuously reviewing my model while I make all these subtle changes, and we're almost at the end of this video demonstration, so I'll see you in the next section where I'll be giving you your homework assignment. Now for your homework assignment, I want you to take your sculpts from part 1's assignment, and I want you to bring it to this level of finish. So go ahead and add some eyes to your sculpt, start to sculpt in more details, and then break symmetry and add more personality to your sculpts. So I'll see you in the next part, and thanks for watching.